The knock came before the sun did. It was the kind of knock that didn't ask permission, desperate, heavy, knuckles against raw wood in the dead hours before dawn. Jack Holloway had been awake already, sitting in the dark beside a fire that had nearly gone cold, staring at nothing the way a man does when sleep has stopped being a friend. He had been sitting like that for 3 years, every morning the same, every night the same. The cabin breathed silence around him, and he had long since stopped fighting it. But that knock, it split the silence like an axe. He rose slowly, his joints stiff from the cold that had crept through the cabin walls overnight, and crossed the narrow room to the door. Outside, the wind was something alive. It clawed at the cracks in the wood, dragged snow sideways across the porch, turned the pale gray of pre-dawn into a blur of white and dark. Jack pulled on his coat, lifted the latch, and opened the door. What he saw stopped him cold. A woman stood on his porch in the snow, thin, painfully, terribly thin, her coat so worn it was more a suggestion of warmth than warmth itself. Behind her, pressed close together in a small, shivering cluster, were 5 children. The oldest looked to be no more than 10 or 11. The youngest was a baby bundled against the woman's chest, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better days. Their faces were gray with cold, their breath coming in small, quick clouds. The woman's eyes, dark and wide and hollow, met his with an expression that had gone far past fear and arrived somewhere quieter, somewhere that looked like the end of hoping. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him. And then, in a voice so low he almost missed it beneath the wind, she said, "Please, take my children. I can't keep them alive out here. Just take them. They're good children. They won't be any trouble." Jack Holloway stood in the doorway of his half-empty cabin in the brutal winter of Frost Hollow Valley, and he looked at this woman and her 5 children, and something deep inside him, something he had believed was permanently frozen, shifted. He stepped back. He opened the door all the way. "Come inside," he said, "all of you." Jack Holloway was 43 years old, and he wore those years the way a fence post wears weather, quietly, without complaint, but with every mark showing. He had come to Frost Hollow Valley as a young man with $30, a second-hand saddle, and a stubbornness that his late father had called a flaw, and that Jack himself had always considered a tool. He had built the cabin with his own hands. He had cleared the land himself. He had coaxed cattle from that rocky ground for 15 years, losing some years and gaining others, and he had survived. He had done more than survive once. There had been a time, not so long ago, though it felt like another man's life now, when the cabin was full, when Emma had been alive. Emma. She had been the kind of woman who could make a 2-room cabin feel like a palace simply by being in it. She had laughed easily and worked harder than any man Jack had ever known, and she had loved him with a steadiness that had been for a long time the most reliable thing in his world. They had talked about children for years, planned for them, dreamed about them, and when the day finally came, when Emma's time arrived on a cold March morning 3 years past, it had seemed at first like the beginning of everything. It had turned out to be the end. Emma had died before the sun went down that day, and the baby, their son, who never drew a breath, had gone with her. The doctor from town, a kind older man named Hargrove, had held Jack's arm for a long while afterward. He had said something about how sometimes these things happened. He had said something about God's plan. Jack had listened to every word and believed none of it. He had buried them together, out behind the cabin where the land sloped gently toward the old oak. He visited every morning. He said nothing when he stood there. Words had always seemed inadequate, and silence, at least, was honest. In the 3 years since, Jack had kept the ranch running through force of habit more than desire. He fed the cattle, he mended the fence, he chopped wood before dawn and sat by a failing fire at night. He ate alone and slept poorly and spoke to almost no one.
The townspeople of Frost Hollow had long since stopped checking on him. He preferred it that way. He told himself he preferred it that way. That was the man who opened his door that morning. That was the man who stepped aside and said, "Come inside." Her name was Sarah Brennan. She told him this while standing just inside the door, her children pressing close against her sides and her back, the baby still clutched to her chest. She was 29 years old, though exhaustion had written additional years across her face. Her husband, Thomas Brennan, had died 11 months ago. A farming accident, she said, quietly, with the practiced brevity of someone who had told the story too many times and had learned to keep it short, to keep it bearable. He had left behind the children, a small farm outside of town, and a debt to the local bank that Sarah had only fully understood the size of when the banker, a man named Aldrich, had come to the farm with 2 hired men and a written notice. She had tried to hold on. She had worked the farm herself through the spring and summer, working until her hands bled and her children went to bed hungry more nights than not. She had asked for help in town and been met with pity that produced no bread, with sympathy that produced no firewood. By November, Aldrich had come back for the farm itself. By December,
she and the children had been living in the old barn behind a neighbor's property, surviving on whatever she could beg or find or earn from odd work. And then a neighbor had told her she could no longer stay. She had walked through the night and most of the following day, through snow that came past her ankles, through wind that had no mercy. She had stopped to 3 homesteads before Jack's. At all 3, she had been turned away. Jack listened to all of this without interruption, standing near the fire he had rebuilt until it threw real heat again, watching the children thaw. They were remarkable children, he thought. They stood quietly, they didn't whine, they held themselves with a dignity that no child should have to learn so young. The oldest was a girl named Lucy, serious-eyed and careful, one arm always around the nearest sibling. There was Sam, maybe 9, who watched everything with the focused attention of a boy who had learned that details mattered. Ben was 6, gap-toothed, trying very hard not to stare at the wall of dried meat hanging in the corner. Lily was 4, small for her age, and she had gone completely still the moment she walked in, looking around the cabin with enormous brown eyes, as though she were seeing something extraordinary. And the baby, Mary, had at last stopped shivering and fallen into an exhausted sleep against her mother's shoulder. Jack went to the pantry. He took down what he had: cornmeal, dried beans, a small joint of cured pork, 2 jars of preserved tomatoes that Emma had put up the summer before she died. He had been saving them in some vague and unexamined way, not quite able to use the last things her hands had touched. He set them on the table now, without hesitation. Sarah watched him. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "I know," said Jack. The days that followed were unlike any Jack had known in 3 long years. The cabin, which had been a monument to absence, became something else entirely. Sarah moved through it with quiet purpose, finding order in corners that had grown cluttered and dark. She repaired a draft in the window with strips of cloth she had sewn together from scraps she found in Emma's old sewing basket. She had asked before touching anything, and Jack had said yes, and had stood in the doorway of that small room afterward for a long moment, breathing. She cooked what little food remained with a skill and economy that made Jack ashamed of how wasteful he had been in his solitude. She stretched the dried beans into 3 separate meals. She made the cornmeal last 4 days. The boys threw themselves into chores with an eagerness that moved Jack unexpectedly. Sam split wood with a hatchet that was slightly too large for him, working steadily and without complaint until the stack against the cabin wall had doubled. Ben followed Jack everywhere, to the barn, to the well, to the fence line, watching everything he did with those serious, attentive eyes and asking careful questions. Jack found himself answering them. He found himself explaining things he hadn't spoken aloud since Emma. The way you read weather by the color of morning light. The way you could tell how cold a night would be by how the cattle stood in the evening. Lucy took on the role of second mother without being asked, managing her younger siblings with a gentle authority that reminded Jack, quietly and painfully, of Emma. She read to the little ones at night from the single worn Bible that was all the family had carried with them, her voice low and steady, the younger children leaning against her in the firelight. But it was Lily who undid him. Lily, 4 years old, small and solemn and enormous-eyed, had decided within the first 48 hours that Jack Holloway was the most interesting person she had ever encountered. She began following him. Not just when he was inside, she would put on her coat and her 2 large boots and trot out after him into the yard, saying nothing, simply accompanying him the way a small, determined shadow accompanies its owner. When he stopped, she stopped. When he moved, she moved. On the 3rd morning, as Jack stood at the fence watching the sky for weather, he felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down. Lily looked up. "Mr. Jack," she said in the grave, careful tone of a child delivering important news, "your hands are very cold." "Yes," he agreed. "You should have gloves." "I lost my gloves." She considered this with great seriousness. Then she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out one small mitten and held it up to him. "You can have one of mine," she said. Jack looked at the small, lopsided mitten. He looked at Lily's solemn little face, and something happened in his chest. Some long-locked door swung open just an inch, letting in light and cold air all at once, and he had to look away at the fence for a moment before he could trust himself to speak. "Thank you, Lily," he managed. She nodded, satisfied, and slipped her hand back into his. Inside the cabin that evening, Jack caught Sarah watching him with the children, and for a brief moment their eyes met across the room. There was no romance in that look. Not yet, not then. There was something more fundamental, the recognition of 2 people who had both been buried under their grief and were, almost despite themselves, being slowly dug out. The food ran out on the 8th day.
Jack stood in the pantry and looked at the empty shelves and counted what he had left. Half a sack of cornmeal, a small amount of salt, and the last 2 jars of coffee. He said nothing to Sarah that morning. He hitched the horse, old mare, gray-muzzled and patient, to the small wagon, and he drove into Frost Hollow. The trading was humiliating in the way that necessary things sometimes are. He traded Emma's silver hairbrush, which he had kept on the dresser for 3 years and never moved. He traded his father's pocket watch. He traded 2 good wool blankets and a leather bridle he had made himself. He came away with flour, salt pork, potatoes, dried corn, a small amount of sugar, and a block of lard. Enough for several weeks if they were careful. But the town itself was another matter. He heard it as he was loading the wagon, voices not meant to carry but carrying anyway in the cold, clear air between the storefronts. A woman he recognized, Mrs. Hallett, speaking to another woman whose back was to him. Living under his roof, all of them, and no ceremony. Jack loaded the last sack and drove home. He did not tell Sarah what he had heard, but she knew. She was not a woman who missed much. "They're talking," she said that evening, not as a question. "Let them," said Jack. "I don't want to cause you trouble." "Sarah," he waited until she looked at him. "You walked through a blizzard with 5 children because no one would help you. Those people who were talking, they turned you away from their doors. I don't put much weight on what they think." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and turned back to the fire. But the greater threat arrived 3 days later in the form of a man named Gerald Aldridge. Aldridge arrived at Jack's property in a good coat and a covered buggy, and he knocked on the door with the measured, unhurried knock of a man who already knows the outcome of the conversation. The news he delivered was simple. Jack was behind on property taxes. The amount owed was due within 2 weeks. Failure to pay would result in proceedings to seize the land. Jack stood in the doorway and listened. Behind him, in the cabin, he could hear the children, Ben asking Sam something in a low voice, Lily humming to herself, the soft sound of Mary sleeping, Sarah moving quietly at the stove. Aldridge smiled. "I know times have been difficult. I'm sure we can work something out." "I'll have the money," Jack said. 2 weeks.
After Aldridge's buggy had disappeared down the snow-covered road, Jack stood on the porch in the cold and added up the numbers in his head. He didn't have the money. He didn't have close to the money. He had traded the last things of value he owned to buy food. What bothered him was the thought of Sarah and those children walking back out into it. That night, after the children were asleep, Jack told Sarah everything. He sat across the small table from her and laid it all out, the taxes, the amount, the deadline, what he had and what he didn't have. He didn't soften it. Sarah listened without interrupting, her hands folded on the table, her face very still. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have something." From the bottom of her battered bag, she withdrew a cloth pouch. Inside was a ring, plain gold, and a pair of small silver earrings, and a folded piece of paper, a note of debt owed to Thomas when he died. "Thomas gave me the ring when we married. The earrings were my mother's." Jack looked at the ring for a moment. "Sarah, I can't take your ring," she said quietly, meeting his eyes. "You're not taking it," she said quietly. "I'm offering it. There's a difference." She paused. "This land is the only shelter my children have. If it goes, we all go back out into that." She glanced toward the sleeping shapes of her children. "I'm not willing to let that happen without a fight." Something passed between them then, not spoken, not needing to be spoken, an understanding, a decision made not in words but in the simple act of two people turning to face the same direction. The next morning, Jack drove into town before sunrise. He spoke to the man who owed the debt, a farmer named Crowell, and found him willing and relieved to pay. He sold the ring and the earrings. He went to see old Hargrove, the doctor who had sat with him on the night Emma died, who had been quietly setting aside what he could. "You should have asked," Hargrove gruffly. "I should have," Jack admitted. When Jack laid the full amount on Aldridge's desk 2 days before the deadline, Aldridge counted it twice. He gave Jack his receipt. Jack drove home. He pulled the wagon up to the cabin and sat there a moment in the cold, looking at the yellow light in the window. Inside, he could see movement, Sarah at the stove, Lucy helping her, the small silhouettes of the others. Light in a window. He had forgotten, somehow, what it looked like. Winter loosened its grip on Frost Hollow Valley slowly, the way it always did, not all at once, but in small surrenders. A day that reached thawing temperature, a morning without new snow, the sound of water running again under the ice at the creek. In those weeks, something grew in the cabin on Jack's land that was difficult to name precisely, and perhaps didn't need naming. Sam had learned to harness the horse by himself, and did it without being asked one morning, while Jack was still drinking his coffee. Ben carried in firewood every afternoon, faithfully, without reminder, growing noticeably stronger as the weeks passed. Lucy had begun asking Jack serious, intelligent questions about the land, about soil and seasons and cattle, and Jack found himself, with surprise, teaching. And Lily still followed him everywhere. She had long since graduated from holding his hand to riding on his shoulders when the snow was too deep for her small boots, calling him Mr. Jack with a proprietary familiarity that made everyone in the cabin smile. One evening in late February, when the children were asleep and the fire was good and the wind outside had settled to something almost gentle, Jack said to Sarah, "I don't want you to leave in the spring." She was quiet for a long while. The fire popped softly. "Jack," she said finally, "I've been nobody's burden my whole adult life. I won't start now." "That's not what I said,"
He turned to face her directly. "What I said is I don't want you to leave. That's different from burden. That's different from charity." He paused. "When you came to my door, I had been alone in this house for 3 years. I had been waiting to feel something again, and I didn't know it because I'd stopped believing it was possible. Your daughter handed me half a mitten in the cold because she didn't want my hands to be cold, and something opened up in me that I thought was closed forever. That's not burden. That's the opposite of burden. That's grace." Sarah looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were bright in the firelight. "I have 5 children," she said softly. "I know. They need a home, a real one. I know that too." She was quiet again. Then, "I think Emma must have been very good." "She was," said Jack. "Then I think she'd understand. I think she'd want this house full of noise again."
The wedding was simple. Just Hargrove as witness and the circuit preacher who came through in early March, speaking words in the cold sitting room while Lily stood on tiptoe to see better, and Ben fidgeted, and Lucy cried quietly, and Sam stood straight as a soldier. Baby Mary slept through the whole thing and was later, the family always said, the most sensible of them all. When it was done, Jack looked at Sarah, this woman who had walked through a blizzard rather than give up on her children, who had offered her wedding ring to save a piece of land that wasn't even hers yet, who had made a cold house warm again simply by being in it. And he thought about what loss does to a person, how it can hollow you, or how it can, if something intervenes, make room. Room for something new, room for something unexpected, room for a family built not from blood, but from one cold morning and an open door, and the particular courage it takes to say yes when everything in you has learned to expect no. They were still in Frost Hollow Valley 2 springs later, and Lily, who had decided before she could fully articulate why, had taken to calling Jack simply Papa. Nobody corrected her, least of all Jack, who found that the word fit, as unexpected and essential as a key finding the right lock. Behind the cabin, beneath the old oak where the land sloped gently, Emma's grave was tended and never forgotten. Jack went there still in the mornings. He talked now, sometimes, not much, but enough. He told her about the children. He told her about Sarah. He told her about Lily and the mitten, and the morning everything had started to come back. He thought more than once that she would have laughed at all of it, the beautiful, improbable, snow-blown way that Grace had arrived at his door. Emma had always loved a good story, and this, by any measure, was one. There is a kind of mercy that moves quietly. It does not announce itself. It does not wait for recognition. It opens a door in the middle of a blizzard and steps back, and in doing so, changes everything. Jack Holloway did not set out to build a family. He set out only to do the thing that was in front of him, to help, because turning away was unthinkable. And Sarah Brennan did not arrive at a stranger's door hoping for love or permanence. She arrived hoping only that her children would survive the night. But that is how the deepest things often begin, not with grand plans, but with small, necessary acts of courage. Not with certainty, but with the willingness to step forward when you cannot see the path. In the brutal cold of Frost Hollow Valley, 6 broken souls found one another, and what they built together, slowly, imperfectly, honestly, was something no winter could touch. They built a home, not from lumber and stone, but from sacrifice and stubbornness and the quiet, enduring decision to keep going.
That is the kind of home that lasts. Subscribe and share. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know or something you believe in, please take a moment to share it with someone who might need it today. Stories like this exist because people like you choose to pass them on. Subscribe to Desert Hearth and ring that bell so you never miss a story. We're right here whenever you need to be reminded that goodness still exists in the world, that quiet courage still walks among us, and that sometimes the most extraordinary things begin with simply opening a door. Until next time, keep the fire burning.